Tonight, we're walking somewhere you've probably seen before. Even if you've never been to England, even if medieval history isn't usually your thing, chances are you've glimpsed this street in photographs, in documentaries, in the background of period dramas that promise a cosy vision of old England. The image is almost painfully timber-framed buildings lean toward each other like old friends sharing secrets. Cobblestones glisten under soft rain. Shop signs swing gently in the damp Yorkshire air. Tourists wander through with ice cream cones, taking photographs, buying souvenirs, generally having a lovely time. The Shambles in York. Today, it's one of the most photographed streets in Europe, a perfectly preserved medieval thoroughfare that looks exactly like what people imagine when they hear the words Old England. It's cute, it's quaint, it's packed with fudge shops and gift stores and places selling Harry Potter merchandise. Because yes, it allegedly inspired Diagon Alley. Every day thousands of people walk its narrow length, completely unaware that beneath their feet, hidden in plain sight, carved into the very architecture they're photographing, lies one of the most disturbing histories any street in Britain has to offer. Because the Shambles wasn't always a tourist attraction, before the fudge shops arrived, before the wand shops opened, before anyone thought to sell postcards featuring its charming crooked buildings, this street served a very different, and that purpose, the reason the street looks the way it looks, the reason the buildings lean the way they lean, the reason the cobblestones are worn the way they're worn, has absolutely nothing to do with magic. So let's dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because the Shambles is, and once you see it, you'll never look at those photographs the same way again. The story of the Shambles begins, as so many medieval stories do, with trade. York, for those who don't know, was once the second most important city in England. London held the crown, obviously, but York was the capital of the north, the administrative heart of everything above the Midlands. It had walls. It had a cathedral. It had a river that brought ships from the North Sea directly into the city centre. And most importantly, it had people. Thousands of them packed into a space that would feel cramped even by modern standards. Trade brought money. Money brought people. People brought more people. Before long, the city was growing faster than anyone had planned. Streets multiplied. Buildings rose. And somewhere in this organic, unplanned explosion of medieval urbanization, a particular street began to form. Narrow, winding, following ancient property lines that predated the Norman conquest. The street's original name wasn't the Shambles. That name came later, and it tells you everything you need to know. In Old English, shamble meant bench or stall. By the medieval period, the word had evolved to describe the specific benches where butchers displayed their meat. A shamble was a butcher's marketplace. So when people started calling this street the Shambles, they weren't being poetic, they were being descriptive. This was where the butchers worked. This was where animals died. This was where blood flowed through the gutters in quantities that would make a modern health inspector faint on the spot. Today, the name sounds charming and historic. In medieval York, it essentially meant the place where dead animals are sold. Not quite as marketable on postcards. But the butchers didn't choose this street randomly. They chose it for reasons that made perfect sense at the time and seem absolutely horrifying now. The street sits on a gentle slope. Not steep enough to notice while walking, but steep enough that water, and whatever the water carried, would naturally flow downward, away from the main market square toward the river. The butchers understood drainage intuitively. Even without engineers, they knew that if they positioned themselves on a slope, the mess would largely take care of itself. Or rather, would take care of itself somewhere downhill, out of sight, out of mind. This was medieval logic in its purest form. The problem wasn't the problem. The problem was where the problem ended up. So the butchers came. And once they came, for centuries the Shambles was butcher central, not just for York, but for a huge swath of northern England. Every morning livestock arrived through the city gates. Pigs, cows, sheep, sometimes goats, whatever had been raised on the surrounding farms and had the misfortune of being healthy enough to sell. The animals were driven through narrow streets, past houses, past churches, past children playing in doorways, until they reached the Shambles. And there, in full public view, they were slaughtered. Now imagine this scene. Not as a tourist, not as someone who can leave whenever they want. Imagine living here. Imagine waking up every morning to the sound of hooves on cobblestones, to the lowing of cattle, to the squealing of pigs who somehow knew what was coming. Imagine opening your window because you had to open your window. There was no glass, just shutters, just oiled, just a desperate attempt to keep out the rain while letting in whatever air wasn't completely contaminated. Imagine the smell. Because here's something the history books don't always emphasize. Medieval cities smelled. They smelled bad. But certain places smelled worse than others, and the Shambles was the worst of the worst. Blood, offal, manure, rot, the sweet sickly smell of death mixed with the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood, mixed with the earthy richness of animal waste, mixed with whatever else had been thrown into the street that day. The combination was unique. It was overwhelming. It was, for the people who lived there, completely normal. Humans are remarkably good at convincing themselves that terrible smells are fine. The brain filters. After a few weeks, you wouldn't even notice the blood anymore. You'd notice when it stopped, when something changed, when the familiar stench was replaced by something unfamiliar and therefore alarming. But the baseline, the constant, the everyday reality of living on a street where animals were slaughtered by the dozen every morning, that would fade into the background. Until you travelled somewhere else and returned. Until you brought visitors who visibly recoiled, and you suddenly remembered, oh right, this is disgusting. The butchers themselves didn't seem to mind. Or maybe they minded but had no choice. Butchering was a profession, a trade, a way to feed a family. You didn't become a butcher because you loved the smell of blood. You became a butcher because your father was a butcher, because your grandfather was a butcher, because your entire extended family had been butchers since before anyone bothered writing things down. The Shambles wasn't just a workplace. It was a community. The butchers lived above their shops, same as every other medieval tradesperson. They raised children in rooms that overlooked the slaughter. They cooked dinner while blood dripped through floorboards from the shop below. They fell asleep to the sound of stray dogs fighting over scraps in the street. And the street, meanwhile, struggled heroically against impossible odds. Let's talk about the gutter. Because the gutter is where this story gets interesting. The gutter is the hero of our narrative, or perhaps the tragic victim, depending on how you look at it. Every medieval street had drainage. Technically, most streets had a central channel, sometimes paved, sometimes just worn into the dirt, designed to carry rainwater and waste away from houses and toward whatever body of water happened to be nearby. The Shambles had one of these channels, running straight down the middle of the street, exactly where you'd expect to find it. And in theory, this channel should have handled the butcher's waste without much trouble. Blood is mostly water. Offal is even the solid bits, if given enough time and enough rain, would eventually break down and wash away. In practice, the gutter struggled. The problem was volume. A single butcher shop might process several animals per day. The Shambles had dozens of butcher shops, packed shoulder to shoulder along both sides of the street, sometimes with additional butchers working from stalls set up in front of the multiply animals per shop, by shops per street, by days per week, by weeks per year, and you end up with a quantity of blood that defies comfortable imagination. Gallons of blood. Hundreds of gallons. thousands of gallons over the course of a year, flowing downhill toward the river, or trying to. The gutter did its best. The gutter channeled. But the gutter was designed for rain, not for the industrial-scale slaughter of livestock. Blood coagulates. Blood thickens. Blood, when mixed with fat and scraps and whatever else ended up on the cobblestones, forms a paste that doesn't flow so much as ooze. And oozing, unfortunately for the residents of the Shambles, is not the same as draining. So the blood accumulated. It pooled in low spots. It clung to cobblestones. It seeped into the gaps between stones and froze there in winter, turning the street into a reddish-brown ice rink that would have been comical if it weren't so horrifying. In summer, the blood baked under the sun, drying into crusty layers that attracted flies by the millions. The flies came from everywhere. They bred in the awful heaps behind the shops. They bred in the gutters. They bred in the cracks between cobblestones where blood had pooled and never quite dried. From a fly's perspective, the Shambles was less a street and more a luxury resort, all-inclusive, open year-round, with unlimited breeding opportunities and absolutely no predators. The residents, meanwhile, developed strategies. They wore shoes that lifted their feet slightly above the street's surface. They walked carefully, placing each foot with deliberate precision, avoiding the worst of the mess. They learned which sections of the street drained properly, and which sections turned into stagnant pools after they accepted that their clothes would smell, that their children would play in filth, that their dinner guests would eat quickly and leave sooner. This was life on the Shambles. This was normal. And normal was about to get much, much worse. Because the blood wasn't the real. The blood was disgusting, certainly. The blood was viscerally unpleasant, in ways that modern sanitation has largely eliminated from our daily experience. But blood alone never killed anyone. Blood alone never emptied cities. Blood alone never reshaped civilization. The real problem was invisible. Now, imagine nicking your finger while a small cut, nothing serious, the kind of injury you'd rinse under the tap and cover with a bandage. Now imagine doing that before antibiotics existed, before antiseptics, before anyone understood that invisible creatures could enter a wound and multiply until your body turned against itself. Suddenly, dinner feels considerably more exciting than intended. The residents of the Shambles lived with cuts. Butchers cut themselves on knives. Housewives cut themselves while preparing meat. Children cut themselves on sharp objects hidden in the streets accumulating filth. And every cut, every scratch, every minor abrasion was an open invitation for infection. The street was basically a petri dish. Bacteria thrived in the blood-soaked gutters. Bacteria flourished in the Bacteria colonized every surface, every crack, every shadow, where moisture lingered and organic matter provided endless nutrition. Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, Clostridium, which causes gas gangrene and has a particular fondness for deep wounds contaminated with soil or fecal matter. And the Shambles had plenty of both. Animals defecated in the street, humans defecated in the street. The gutter carried everything together in one magnificent slurry of infection risk. A small cut could kill you, a splinter could kill you, a scratch from a rusty nail hidden in the muck could kill you in ways that were painful, prolonged, and utterly unstoppable. Once infection set in, once the bacteria established themselves in your tissues, there was very little anyone could do. Physicians might bleed you, might apply poultice, might pray over you while you burned with fever and your skin turned black, and your family watched you die. But they couldn't stop the infection. They couldn't even see it. The enemy was invisible, and medieval medicine had no weapons against the invisible. But the Shambles produced an even more dangerous invisible enemy, one that didn't require an open wound, one that didn't require physical contact, one that could enter your body through your lungs, through the simple act of breathing, and kill you before you even realized you were sick. The butchers processed animals constantly. They cut through hides, through muscle, through organs. They handled carcasses that had been alive hours earlier, that had been healthy hours earlier, that had carried who knows what in their blood and tissues. And every time a butcher made a cut, every time an animal was opened, every time blood sprayed or organs were removed, particles became airborne. Tiny droplets, microscopic specks, things you couldn't see but could definitely breathe. Brucellosis, contracted from handling infected animal tissues, causes fevers that come and go for weeks. Joint pain, fatigue so profound you can barely stand. Anthrax, rare but present, can be inhaled from contaminated animal products and kills with terrifying speed. Various parasites, various bacteria, various pathogens that had evolved alongside livestock for thousands of years and were very good at jumping from animals to humans when conditions were right. The Shambles made conditions very right. And yet, life continued. The butchers kept butchering. The residents kept residing. The street kept flowing with blood and waste, and the endless detritus of medieval urban existence. Because what else were they supposed to do? Move? Where? To another street that probably wasn't much better? Stop butchering and do what? The system worked, after a fashion. It worked the way medieval systems always worked, through sheer human stubbornness and a remarkable tolerance for unpleasantness. People got sick, people died, but enough people survived that the city kept growing, kept trading, kept functioning despite the blood-soaked street running through its heart. Then the rats arrived. Well, rats are not newcomers to human civilization. They've been with us since we started storing grain, since we started building permanent settlements, since we started creating exactly the kind of warm, sheltered, food-rich environments that rats dream about. The Shambles had rats, lots of rats. The butchers provided unlimited food scraps, unlimited height, unlimited opportunities for rat populations to explode beyond anything nature would normally permit. For centuries, the rats were just another fact of life. Annoying, destructive, occasionally responsible for fires when they gnawed through lamp wicks or chewed on matches, but fundamentally manageable, or at least tolerable, in the way that medieval people tolerated almost everything we would find unbearable. Then came 1348. The Black Death arrived in England, and everything changed forever. Now, you've heard about the Black Death. Everyone has heard about the Black Death. It's one of those historical events that even people who don't care about history know something about. But knowing about it is not the same as understanding it. Understanding requires sitting with the numbers for a moment, really feeling what they mean. Europe lost somewhere between 30 and 50% of its population. Half the people died. Half, in some regions, the death toll exceeded 60%. Entire villages vanished. Entire families disappeared. Cities that had taken centuries to build were reduced to hollow shells. Their streets silent except for the carts that collected bodies each morning. Their churches overflowing with corpses because there weren't enough healthy people left to dig graves. York was hit hard. The Shambles was hit harder. Because remember what the Shambles was: a street of butchers, a street of animal processors, a street where blood flowed openly, where offal accumulated, where rats bred in staggering numbers. The Black Death spread primarily through fleas that lived on rats. When the rats died, which they did in droves, the fleas jumped to the nearest available, and the nearest available warm bodies were standing right there in the Shambles, cutting meat, breathing air thick with particles, going about their daily business, completely unaware that death had already marked them. The first symptoms appeared within days. Fever, chills, headaches so severe you couldn't lift your head. Then the swellings, the buboes, the black lumps in the groin or armpits or neck that gave the disease its name. The buboes were not subtle. They grew to the size of eggs, sometimes larger, hot to the touch, excruciatingly painful. Victims often died within a week, sometimes within days, sometimes within hours of the worst symptoms appearing. On the Shambles, death came faster than anywhere else in York. The concentration of rats, the concentration of people, the concentration of organic matter that provided perfect breeding conditions for fleas, all combined to create a death rate that exceeded even the terrifying citywide average. Butchers died at their stalls. Their families died in the rooms above. Neighbours died while trying to help, or while simply staying inside and hoping the plague would pass them by. The plague did not pass them by. Within months, the Shambles was transformed. The street that had once been packed with butchers and customers and animals and children and the endless chaotic energy of medieval commerce became silent. Not peaceful silent. Not rest. The silence of abandonment, of death, of the moment when a community realizes that half the people they knew are gone and the other half are probably leaving. Some butchers survived. Most didn't. The ones who lived faced a world that had changed in ways no one could fully process. There were no more lines at the market, no more competition for customers, no more pressure to lower prices or work longer hours. Half your competitors were dead, which meant half your competition was dead, which meant you could charge whatever you wanted for meat, assuming you had meat to sell. But the animals were gone too. The farms that supplied the Shambles had been hit as hard as the city. Farmers died. Herds went untended. Fields went unplanted. The entire economic system, the carefully calibrated network of producers and transporters and sellers and buyers, had been shattered. You could charge high prices for meat, but only if someone had meat to sell you, and only if someone had money to buy, and only if the person buying it wasn't too busy burying their family to care about dinner. The Shambles survived the Black Death, but barely. And the way it survived, the changes that came after, would reshape the street in ways that are still visible today. Here's the strange thing about catastrophic population loss. It's terrible. Obviously, unspeakably terrible for everyone who lived, but from a purely structural perspective, from the cold economic view that history sometimes forces us to take, the Black Death created opportunities. The survivors inherited the world. All of it. Every job, every house, every field, every resource that had once been shared among millions now belonged to a much smaller number of people. Wages skyrocketed. Labourers who had once worked for pennies could now demand silver. Peasants who had once been tied to specific plots of land could now negotiate with desperate landlords offering better terms. Women who had once been excluded from certain trades could now step into roles left vacant by dead men. The old rules, the old hierarchies, the old certainties about who deserved what, all of it collapsed along. The Shambles reflected this change. Butchers who survived found themselves in an unprecedented position. They could charge more, they could work less, they could demand better conditions, better drainage, better something, anything, that would make their disgusting streets slightly more bearable. And for the first time in history, the city listened. Because the city would always need butchers. Even after the plague, even after the population crash, people still needed to eat. Meat was a luxury for many, but enough people wanted it that butchers remained essential workers, the kind of essential that gives you leverage when negotiating with authorities who previously wouldn't have given you the time of day. The Shambles got proper drainage channels, not just worn grooves in the cobblestones. regulations about how quickly offal had to be removed, rules about washing blood into the gutter rather than letting it pool. None of these changes would satisfy a modern health inspector, obviously, but they represented progress, real progress, the kind of incremental improvement that only becomes possible when workers have power they didn't have before. The street physically changed too. Buildings that had collapsed during the plague years, left empty, their owners dead, and their heirs uncertain, but they were rebuilt differently. Medieval construction was organic, responsive, shaped by available materials and immediate needs rather than long-term planning. The new buildings on the Shambles leaned. They leaned toward each other, their upper stories extending further over the street than the stories below. A technique that maximized floor space without widening the building. This leaning is the Shambles' most famous feature today. Tourists photograph it constantly. The way the buildings almost touch overhead, creating a tunnel-like effect that seems magical, almost supernatural. But the leaning wasn't aesthetic. The leaning was practical, economic, driven by the simple reality that street-level space was limited and upper-level space could be expanded outward as long as your neighbours did the same. The butchers built their new shops with wider upper stories, because wider upper stories meant more room for drying meat, more room for storing tools, more room for living. The families who occupied those upper stories learned to walk carefully, to stay away from the outer walls where the floor sloped most dramatically, to accept that their homes were slowly, imperceptibly moving. And the street below narrowed. Where once two carts could pass each other with careful manoeuvring, now one cart barely fit. Where once pedestrians had room to avoid the worst of the gutter, now they walked directly through the channel, their feet splashing through whatever the morning's slaughter had produced. The leaning buildings created a canyon, dark and damp and perpetually shadowed, a place where sunlight reached only at midday, and even then only briefly. The Shambles became what it is today, not through planning, not through design, but through centuries of accumulated choices, each one sensible in its context, each one contributing to a street that was simultaneously functional and monstrous. But the Black Death wasn't the only catastrophe the Shambles faced. History rarely stops at one disaster. Once the plague passed, once the population stabilized, once the butchers settled into their new normal, other threats emerged. Fire. Medieval cities burned constantly, catastrophically, with a regularity that seems almost comical until you remember how many people died in those flames. York burned in 1137, destroying much of the city including parts of the Shambles. It burned again in 1260, again in 1298, again throughout the 14th and 15th centuries in smaller fires that damaged buildings without destroying entire. The Shambles, with its wooden buildings leaning close enough to kiss, with its thatched roofs and open flames and stored fats that burned like oil, was a fire waiting to happen. Every day was a gamble. Every unattended candle, every knocked-over lamp, every spark from a blacksmith's forge somewhere nearby could turn the street into an inferno within minutes. The butchers knew this. They lived with the knowledge the way we live with the knowledge that cars crash, that planes fall, that any ordinary day can become extraordinary in the worst possible way. They kept buckets of water near their doors. They slept lightly, waking at every unusual sound. They watched their neighbours' buildings as carefully as their own. Because fire didn't respect. When fire came to the Shambles, which it did eventually, it came with a vengeance. The exact date varies depending on which chronicle you trust, but sometime in the late medieval period, a fire swept through the street, consuming buildings that had stood for generations, destroying accumulated wealth and stored goods and irreplaceable. The butchers rebuilt, as butchers always rebuilt, using the same techniques, the same materials, the same dangerous proximity that had made the fire possible in the first place. Because what else could they do? Stone was expensive. Brick was unknown. Timber was what they had. Timber was what they knew. Timber was what their fathers and grandfathers had used since the Shambles first became a street. You don't abandon centuries of building tradition because of a fire. You rebuild the same way and hope the next fire spares you. The next fire did not spare them, nor the one after that. The Shambles burned repeatedly throughout its history, each time rising again, each time slightly different, each time carrying forward the essential character that made it the Shambles. The leaning returned, the narrowness returned, the blood returned. Because no matter how many times the street burned, the butchers always came back. Beyond fire, beyond plague, beyond the everyday hazards of life on a medieval slaughter street, the Shambles faced another threat. One that had nothing to do with disease or disaster, and everything to do with human nature. Crime, violence, the chaos that emerges when desperate people live in desperate circumstances with minimal oversight and fewer consequences. The Shambles was not a safe neighbourhood. It had never been safe, not really. But in the aftermath of the Black Death, with the population reduced and the authorities overwhelmed, safety became something that existed only in theory. In practice, the street was dangerous after dark, dangerous at dawn, dangerous at any hour when the respectable citizens were indoors and the less respectable citizens were outside. The butchers themselves contributed to the danger. Not intentionally, usually, but butchery is violent work, and violence has a way of bleeding into everyday life. The men who killed animals for a living, who cut throats and drained blood and dismembered carcasses with routine efficiency, were not necessarily violent toward other humans. But they carried knives. They were strong. And when arguments broke out over prices or territory, or the million petty disputes that arise when people live packed together, those arguments could escalate quickly. City records from the period show frequent disturbances on the Shambles. Assaults, thefts, occasional deaths, ruled accidental or justified, or simply ignored depending on who died and who. The street had a reputation, not quite as bad as the worst parts of London, but bad enough that respectable citizens avoided it after dark. Respectable citizens avoided it during daylight too, unless they needed meat. The meat was good. The meat was fresh. The meat was worth navigating a street that smelled like death and attracted people who looked at you with eyes that had seen. Women walked the Shambles carefully, if they walked it at all. Children were warned to stay close to home, not to wander, not to talk to strangers, not to accept anything from anyone. The street was a place of business, not a place of leisure, not a place of comfort, not a place where you lingered unless you had to. And yet, people did linger. People raised families there, fell in love there, grew old there, died there. The Shambles was home, whatever its dangers, whatever its smells, whatever its reputation. Home is a powerful thing. Home is where you make do. Home is where you adapt. Home is where you convince yourself that the blood in the gutter is just part of life, that the leaning walls are just part of that the darkness at noon is just part of the atmosphere. The human mind can normalize almost anything. That's not a weakness. That's a survival mechanism. If you couldn't normalize the horrors of your environment, you'd never get out of bed. The people of the Shambles normalized their street because they had no choice. They normalized the blood, the flies, the stench, the danger. They normalized death. Because death was everywhere, not just on the Shambles, but throughout medieval England, throughout medieval Europe, throughout a world where infant mortality hovered around 30%, and most adults didn't expect to see their 50th birthday. Normalization is how humanity survives. Normalization is also how we end up living on streets that should have been condemned centuries before anyone thought to condemn them. Let's pause here for a moment. Let's step back from the shambles and think about what this street tells us about medieval life more broadly. Because the shambles wasn't unique. It wasn't some horrible outlier, some worst-case example that history holds up to make us grateful for modern plumbing. The shambles was normal. That's the terrifying part. That's the part that should keep you up at night if you think about it too long. Most medieval streets were filthy. Most medieval streets had open drains. Most medieval streets hosted trades that produced waste, that attracted vermin, that created conditions we would consider uninhabitable. But the shambles concentrated all of this into one narrow, leaning, perpetually The shambles took the typical medieval urban experience and intensified it, amplified it, pushed it to extremes that even other medieval people found noteworthy. Visitors to York commented on the shambles. They wrote about it in letters, in diaries, in the kind of casual observations that historians later mine for evidence of what life was really. The shambles was famous, or infamous, depending on your perspective. People came from other cities specifically to see this street where the buildings almost touched and the butchers worked in blood up to their ankles. They came to be horrified. They came to be fascinated. They came, in some cases, to buy meat that was supposedly better than anything available because the shambles butchers had generations of experience and took pride in their work despite their appalling working conditions. The meat really was good. By all accounts, the shambles produced excellent beef, pork, lamb, everything a medieval carnivore could want. The butchers knew their trade. They knew which animals to buy, which cuts to offer, which customers to cultivate. The blood and filth and flies were incidental, the price of doing business, the unfortunate reality that separated the animal from the... Medieval people understood this trade-off better than we do. They didn't have the luxury of pretending that meat came from sterile factories, wrapped in plastic, divorced from the reality of death. When you bought meat on the shambles, you saw where it came from. You saw the animal that morning, alive, breathing, waiting to die. You saw the blood in the gutter. You smelled the awful heaps. You walked through the same filth as the butchers, breathing the same air, risking the same infections, and you bought the meat anyway, because you had to eat, because meat was protein, was calories, was survival, because the alternative, not eating, was worse than any amount of filth. This is the dark logic that underpins human civilization. We accept terrible conditions because the alternative is worse. We normalize horror because horror is better than death. We build streets where blood flows in gutters because we need to eat, because we need to work, because we need to live somewhere anywhere, even if that somewhere is fundamentally disgusting. The shambles is a monument to that logic, a physical testament to everything humans will tolerate, everything we'll accept, everything we'll normalize in our ongoing struggle to survive, and maybe even thrive. But the shambles didn't stay medieval forever. Nothing stays medieval forever, except maybe the buildings themselves. By the 17th century, by the 18th, by the 19th, the street began to change, slowly at first, then faster, as the Industrial Revolution reshaped England and medieval ways of life became obsolete or embarrassing or simply no longer profitable. The butchers started leaving. Not all at once, not in a dramatic exodus, but gradually, one by one, as the old shops became less viable and new opportunities opened elsewhere. York was changing. England was changing. The whole world was changing, powered by coal and steam and the relentless logic of industrial capitalism. Traditional butchery, the kind that happened on the shambles, the kind where animals walked to their death through city streets and blood flowed openly in gutters, became increasingly unacceptable to a society that prized order, cleanliness, efficiency. New slaughterhouses opened on the outskirts, modern facilities, designed with drainage in mind, with waste removal systems, with the kind of industrial scale processing that made street-level butchery look like a peasant operation. The butchers who wanted to stay in business moved to these new facilities, leaving their old shops behind. Some retired, some died. Some converted their shops into other businesses, selling things that didn't require blood or guts or the constant risk of infection. By the 20th century, the Shambles was no longer a butcher street. A few shops remained, remnants of the old trade, serving customers who valued tradition over convenience. But most of the street had transformed into something else entirely. Shops selling souvenirs. Shops selling the kind of tourist-oriented merchandise that appears in every historic district, in every city that has ever hosted a visitor with money to spend. The transformation accelerated in the late 20th century as heritage tourism became big business and cities realized that medieval streets could be monetized. The Shambles was perfect for this. It was authentic, or at least authentic enough for tourists who didn't know the difference between genuinely medieval architecture and Victorian restoration. It had a name that sounded charming, that conjured images of old England, that didn't immediately translate to place where animal. Marketing teams got to work. Brochures were printed. Websites were built. The Shambles became a destination, a place you visited specifically to walk down that narrow street and take that photograph and buy that souvenir and feel like you'd experienced something genuinely historical. And almost no one mentioned the blood. Here's where we need to talk about what the Shambles hides. Not intentionally, not through conspiracy, but through the gentle erasure that time performs on all uncomfortable truths. The blood is gone. The gutters are clean. The butchers have moved on. Those that remain are carefully curated, presented as heritage rather than as commerce. The street today is almost sterile compared to its medieval self, scrubbed and maintained and monitored by officials who would never allow an animal to be slaughtered in public view. But the architecture remembers. The buildings still lean. The street still narrows. The cobblestones still show the wear of centuries, the grooves worn by cartwheels, the hollows worn by countless feet. If you know what to look for, the Shambles were not as a charming medieval street, not as Diagon alley, not as a backdrop for tourist photographs, but as what it really was, a place of death, a place of survival, a place where humans did terrible things because terrible things needed doing. Look at the windows. In medieval times, the butchers displayed their meat on broad stone shelves that extended outward from the shop front. Those shelves are still there, worn smooth by centuries of use, now holding potted plants or decorative items or nothing at all. The hooks that once held carcasses are still embedded in some of the exterior walls, rusted and forgotten, invisible unless you're looking for them. Look at the doorways. They're low, because medieval people were shorter than, but also because every inch of height reduced the available space inside, and butchers needed all the space they could get. The thresholds are worn, concave, where generations of feet stepped through, carrying meat in and waste out, and the endless back and forth of. Look at the pavement. Not the modern pavement, the tourist-friendly surface that's been relaid and repaired countless times. Look at the edges, the margins, the places where the modern surface ends and something older begins. The original cobblestones are still there, buried beneath layers of history, still holding the residue of everything that's been spilled on them. The Shambles hides its past, and you can walk down it today, buy fudge, take pictures, have a lovely time, and never notice that you're walking through a slaughterhouse. The past is there, always there, but it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand your attention. It waits, patient and indifferent, for someone to ask the right questions. This is how not through dramatic revelations, not through shocking discoveries, but through accumulated details that most people never notice. The Shambles is a document, a physical text written in timber and stone and cobblestone. If you learn to read that text, the street tells you everything. Where the blood flowed, where the butchers lived and worked and raised children, who grew up thinking that the smell of death was just the smell of home. There's one more layer to this story. One more darkness hiding beneath the charming surface. Not the blood, not the plague, not the fire or the crime or the everyday horror of medieval urban existence. Something that touches on the psychology of the Shambles, on the way the street shaped the minds of the people who lived there, on the lingering effects that might still be felt today. Medieval people believed things. We know this. We laugh at some of their beliefs. The way they blamed disease on miasma or sin, or the alignment of planets. But we don't fully understand how those beliefs felt from the inside. For the people of the Shambles, the world was haunted. Not figuratively. Literally, the dead were present. The dead were active. The dead had opinions and preferences, and the ability to interfere in the lives of the living. The Shambles produced a lot of dead. Animals died constantly, obviously, but humans died too. Died young, died violently, died in ways that left questions unanswered. Every shop on the street had seen death. Every building contained memories of people who had lived there, worked there, breathed there, and then stopped. In a world without modern medicine, without effective sanitation, without the safety nets that make death exceptional rather than routine, death was simply part of the background. The background of the Shambles was particularly dense with death. So the residents believed in ghosts. They believed in spirits that lingered near the places where they died, that returned at specific times, that manifested as sounds or smells or sudden chills. The Shambles had more than its share of ghost stories. Butchers who'd been murdered in disputes, their spirits still wandering the street looking for justice. Animals whose deaths had been particularly painful, their ghosts haunting the slaughter spots. Children who'd died of plague, their small forms glimpsed in doorways, disappearing. Modern tourists sometimes report strange experiences on the Shambles, feelings of being watched, sudden temperature drops, unexplained sounds, footsteps when no one's there, whispers that might be wind or might be something else. Most of these experiences have rational explanations, drafts, acoustics, the power of... But some people leave the street convinced they've encountered something beyond the rational. The Shambles has a reputation, even today, even among people who don't believe in ghosts, for feeling different, for feeling heavy, for feeling like a place where things happened that haven't entirely finished happening. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, this reputation matters. It shapes the way people experience the street. It adds a layer of meaning that the fudge shops and souvenir stores can't erase. The Shambles is haunted, not necessarily by spirits but by history, by the accumulated weight of everything that happened there, by the millions of deaths, animal and human, that soaked into the cobblestones and the timber, and you can feel it if you're paying attention. The street breathes differently than other streets. The light falls differently. The shadows are deeper, the corners darker, the spaces between buildings somehow more present than they should be. The Shambles is not a place you forget. Even if you only visit once, even if you spend most of your time eating fudge and taking photographs, something stays with you. An impression, a memory, a sense that you've been somewhere that matters, somewhere that contains more than what's visible on the surface. That's the Shambles' final trick. It hides its darkness, but it doesn't bury it. The darkness remains, accessible to anyone willing to look, willing to ask, willing to sit with the uncomfortable reality that charming streets often have terrible histories. The Shambles is honest about this in its way. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. It simply waits for visitors to notice. Most don't. Most walk through, buy their souvenirs, leave, and never think about the blood. That's fine. That's how tourism works. But for those who do notice, for those who pause and look and wonder, the Shambles offers something rare. A glimpse of not the sanitized past, not the romantic past, but the past as it actually was. Filthy, dangerous, haunted, and utterly stubbornly human. We've spent a lot of time on the Shambles. But our title promised more, and more, it said, suggesting that one medieval street, however fascinating, wasn't quite enough for tonight's journey. So let's widen our lens. Let's look at other places where history hides in plain sight, where charming exteriors conceal dark realities, where the past refuses to stay buried despite our best efforts to pave over it. Consider London's Fleet Street. Today it's known for newspapers, for journalism, for the kind of professional hustle that defined British media But before the printers arrived, before the presses rolled, Fleet Street had a different reputation. It was the centre of London's funeral trade. Undertakers, coffin makers, grave diggers, all the professions associated with death, clustered on Fleet Street, because the street connected the city of London to the western suburbs, where the wealthy were building new homes, and inevitably, the bodies travelled through Fleet Street, hundreds of them, thousands of them, carried in processions that could stretch for blocks. The undertakers knew their business. They offered packages, deluxe funerals for those who could afford them, basic services for those who couldn't. They competed for customers, sometimes aggressively, sometimes in ways that bordered on death was business, and business was good. The street itself reflected this trade. Shop windows displayed coffins, sometimes elaborately decorated, sometimes plain, always present, always reminding passers-by of their own mortality. The smell of embalming fluid mixed with the smell of flowers, the fresh flowers that families bought to honour their dead, the wilting flowers that were discarded and replaced, and discarded again. Fleet Street was a street of death, hidden in plain sight, overlooked by the journalists who later made their names there. Or consider Edinburgh's Merry Kings, buried beneath the city's Royal Mile, sealed off from the world for centuries. This underground street preserves the reality of medieval urban life better than almost any other site in Britain. The close was narrow, dark, overcrowded, a warren of tenements where Edinburgh's poor lived packed together in conditions that would have seemed appalling even by Shambles' standards. When the plague came, as it did repeatedly, the close became a death trap. Bodies piled up. Survivors fled. Eventually, the city simply built over the close, sealing it beneath newer buildings, leaving it as a time capsule of medieval misery. Today, you can tour Mary King's Close. You can walk through the preserved rooms, see the spots where plague victims died, hear the stories of the people who lived and died there. The guides are excellent, knowledgeable, skilled at making history feel present, but they can't fully convey what the close was really like. The darkness, the smells, the constant proximity of death, the knowledge that at any moment plague could enter your home and take everyone you loved. These places exist all over Britain, all over Europe, all over the world, streets that hide dark pasts beneath charming surfaces, buildings that witnessed horrors and then went back to business as usual, neighbourhoods that carried the weight of history without ever acknowledging it. What makes these places worth visiting, worth thinking about, worth including in a documentary script that's already run quite long? Not morbidity, not the cheap thrill of contemplating death. Something deeper. Something about how humans process the past. How we decide what to remember and what to forget. How we build our identities on foundations that we've deliberately obscured. The Shambles today is a lie. A pleasant lie. A lie that most people want to believe. A lie that makes money and creates jobs and brings joy to thousands of visitors every year. But a lie nonetheless. The real Shambles, the medieval Shambles, the street of blood and death and survival against impossible odds, is almost completely absent from the tourist experience. You have to dig for it. You have to read the books, study the records, look past the fudge shops and the wand stores and the cheerful signage that promises a good time for the whole family. This is how we treat most of history. We sanitize it. We romanticize it. We turn it into entertainment, into spectacle, into something we can consume without being disturbed. The past becomes a theme park, and we become tourists in our own heritage, wandering through reconstructed streets and restored buildings, never quite touching the reality that those streets and buildings contain. The Shambles resists this, not intentionally, not through any conscious design, but through the sheer weight of its own history. The buildings still lean, the street still narrows, the shadows still fall the way they fell centuries ago, when butchers worked in blood and plague killed half the city and the dead were everywhere, present, watching, waiting for something that never quite. You can walk the Shambles today and feel it. That resistance, that refusal to be fully erased. The past doesn't demand your attention. It doesn't grab you by the collar and force you to look. It simply exists, patient and indifferent, waiting for the moment when you pause, when you wonder, when you ask the question that opens the door to everything hidden beneath the surface. Let's return to the Shambles one more time. Let's walk it together, in our imagination, on a quiet evening when the tourists have gone and the shops are closed and the street belongs to itself. The cobblestones are wet. It's been raining, as it so often does in York, and the water has pooled in the low spots. The same low spots where blood once pooled, where offal once accumulated, where the gutter struggled and often lost. The streetlights cast a soft glow, warm and yellow, illuminating the leaning buildings, the worn doorways, the stone shelves that once displayed meat and now display nothing. The air is cool, clean, nothing like the air that butchers breathed, that plague victims breathed, that medieval children breathed while playing in filth. But the air still moves the same way, funneled by the narrow canyon, carrying sounds from one end of the street to the other. You can hear footsteps in the distance, voices, muffled, indistinct, the creak of a sign swinging in the breeze. If you listen closely, if you let your imagination work, you might hear other sounds. The lowing of cattle, driven through the street at dawn, the squeal of pigs, the splash of blood, hitting cobblestones, running downhill toward the gutter that could never quite keep up. The shouts of butchers, calling to customers, arguing with each other, living their lives in a world that had no time for sentimentality about where meat came from. The Shambles contains all of these sounds. Even now, they're not literally present, not audible to human ears, but they're present in the way that memory is present, in the way that history is present, in the way that everything that ever happened remains somehow attached to the places where it happened. This is why we study history, not to judge the past, not to feel superior to people who lived in filth and died young, but to understand that we are them. We are the same species, with the same needs, the same fears, the same capacity for normalizing the abnormal. The people of the Shambles were not fundamentally different from us. They lived in conditions we can barely imagine, accepted realities we would find unbearable, but they were human, fully human. As human as anyone walking the street today, buying fudge, taking photographs, having a lovely time. History is not a foreign country. It's our own country, seen through a filter of time. The Shambles is not a relic of a dead past. It's a living document, a continuous thread connecting medieval butchers to modern tourists, connecting blood and death to fudge and souvenirs. The connection is uncomfortable, which is why most people ignore it. But it's real. And once you see it, once you understand what the Shambles really is and what it really contains, you can't unsee it. The blood is gone. The butchers have moved on. The plague is a memory, studied by historians, commemorated by plaques, safely contained in the past, where it can't hurt anyone anymore. But the Shambles remains, leaning and narrow and perpetually shadowed, hiding its darkness in plain sight, waiting for the next person to pause and wonder and ask the question that opens the door. Tonight, that person was you. So next time you see a photograph of the Shambles, next time someone posts a picture of that charming medieval street with the leaning buildings and the cobblestones and the warm golden light, you'll know. You'll see beyond the surface. You'll see the blood in the gutters, the offal in the street, the butchers working in conditions that would make a modern slaughterhouse inspector weep. You'll see the plague, the fire, the crime. You'll see the past, hiding in plain sight, refusing to be erased despite centuries of effort. And maybe you'll feel a little differently about fudge shops after, but probably not. Fudge is delicious after all, and humans are remarkably good at ignoring uncomfortable truths when there's sugar involved. The Shambles understands this. The Shambles has seen everything, tolerated everything, absorbed everything that humans have thrown at it for nearly 1,000 years. A few tourists eating fudge while standing on cobblestones soaked in blood? That's nothing. That's Tuesday. The Shambles will outlast us all. The buildings will keep leaning, the cobblestones will keep wearing, the shadows will keep falling, the same way they've fallen since, before anyone thought to write down the street's name. And long after we're gone, long after our own histories have been forgotten, or sanitized, or turned into tourist attractions, the Shambles will still be there, hiding its darkness in plain sight, waiting for someone to pause and wonder. Tonight you paused. Tonight you wondered. And that, more than any fact or figure or historical detail, is why we tell these stories. Not to horrify, not to depress, not to make you grateful for modern plumbing, but to connect. To remind you that history is not distant, not abstract, not safely contained in books and documentaries. History is here. History is now. History is the ground beneath your feet, and the air in your lungs and the blood in your veins, flowing the same way it flowed 1,000 years ago, through people who were just like you and nothing like you at the same time. The Shambles is a mirror. Look into it long enough, and you see yourself. Not the self you present to the world, the tourist self, the fudge-eating self, the self that takes photographs and moves on, but the deeper self, the self that would do whatever it takes to survive, the self that would normalize the abnormal, accept the unacceptable, live in filth and blood and death, because the alternative was worse. That self is still there, buried beneath centuries of civilization, beneath sanitation and medicine and the comfortable belief that we're better than our ancestors. But we're not better. We're luckier. We were born in an age of antibiotics and indoor plumbing and food safety regulations. The people of the Shambles weren't lucky. They were just human, doing their best. And their street remains, leaning and narrow and perpetually shadowed, as a testament to everything they endured. Not a monument, not a memorial, not anything so grand. Just a street where blood once flowed and butchers once worked, and people once lived and died and loved and lost and kept going. Because that's what humans do. We keep going. Through plague and fire and the everyday horror of existence, we keep going. The Shambles is proof. Not of human cruelty, not of human squalor, but of human endurance. We can survive almost anything. We can normalize almost anything. We can build lives in the midst of death and call it home. That's the real story of the Shambles. That's the darkness hiding, not the blood, not the plague, not the ghosts, but the simple, terrifying, beautiful truth that humans can live anywhere, survive anything, and still find reasons to smile, to laugh, to love, to keep going. The fudge shops are still open after all. Thanks for staying with me tonight. Thanks for walking the Shambles, for looking past the surface, for being the kind of person who pauses. History needs more people like you. The past needs witnesses, people willing to see what's really there, not just what's comfortable and convenient. The Shambles will be waiting the next time you find yourself in York. The buildings will still lean. The cobblestones will still be worn. The shadows will still fall the same way they've fallen for centuries, the same way they'll fall for centuries. And maybe, just maybe, you'll look at that charming medieval street and see something different, something deeper, something that connects you to all the people who walked that street before, who bled on those cobblestones, who died in those buildings, who lived and loved and lost and kept going. You're connected to them, by blood, by bone, by the simple fact of being human. The Shambles knows that the Shambles has always known. And now, tonight, so do you. Sleep well. Dream of cobblestones and leaning buildings and shadows that move when you're not looking. Dream of blood and fudge, and the strange alchemy that turns horror into history, history into tourism, tourism into memory. Dream of the Shambles, where the past is always present and the present is always haunted and the future is just another customer. Walking through, buying fudge, taking photographs, having a lovely time. The gutter is clean now, the blood is gone, but the street remembers, and now so do you.